Thanksgiving, my son's wife pressed a serving fork into the back of my hand hard enough to break the skin, and when I pulled away and the gravy boat went over and shattered on the kitchen tile, my son looked at the mess, looked at me bleeding onto my own dish towel and said, "You're being selfish, Mom, after everything they've done for you." I didn't argue. I wrapped my hand, told everyone to enjoy the pie, and drove myself to the urgent care on Route 7 with the radio off. While the nurse cleaned the wound, I sent one text. It went to my attorney, and it said only, "They moved. We're done waiting." That was all it took. 3 weeks earlier, I'd promised myself I would not lift a finger until they crossed a line they couldn't walk back. They had just crossed it, on camera, in front of his wife's parents, and they had no idea that the quiet, foggy old woman pouring their wine had spent 38 years catching people exactly like them. My name is Estelle. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my adult life, I worked as a forensic accountant for a regional bank up in Burlington, the kind of job nobody ever asked me about twice at a dinner party. People hear accountant, and their eyes go soft and far away. They picture a small woman with reading glasses adding up receipts. What I actually did was trace money that didn't want to be traced. I sat across from men in good suits who had skimmed from pension funds and laundered it through shell companies, and I found the thread they thought they'd hidden, and I pulled it until the whole thing came apart in their laps. I was good at it. I was good at it because I'm patient, and because I never let anyone see what I already know. My husband Henry used to say I had a poker face that could survive a house fire. He'd been a Navy man, then a high school shop teacher for 26 years, and he loved this house on the lake more than anything in the world except me and the boy we raised in it. He planted the maples along the drive himself, 2 rows of them, sugar maples, so that every October the whole approach to the house turned the color of a struck match. He built the dock. He built the bench at the end of the dock. He died in the front bedroom 3 years ago in November with my hand in both of his. And the last thing he asked me was to keep the house. Not for sentiment. He knew. He said, "Estelle, the second I'm gone, somebody is going to try to talk you out of this house. Don't let them. It's the only thing of ours that's truly yours." He knew our son. Bradley was 41 that fall. A sweet boy once, genuinely. I'm not one of those mothers who rewrites the past so the present makes sense. He used to leave me dandelions on the kitchen sill, fistfuls of them with the roots still on, and he cried at the end of every animal movie ever made. But somewhere in his 30s, the softness in him hardened into something that only looked like ambition. He started 3 businesses and folded all 3. A landscaping company, a thing with vending machines, and last a consulting outfit that, as far as I could ever tell, consisted of a website and a leased SUV. Each time, Henry quietly covered the whole. Each time Bradley thanked us, and then within a year he was back at the kitchen table with a new folder and the same hungry look. He married Sloane 8 years ago. I tried with her. I want that on the record. I knit a blanket for their first apartment. I learned to make the cardamom rolls her grandmother used to make. I bit my tongue more times than I can count. But Sloane looked at this house the way a real estate developer looks at a parking lot. The first Christmas she came up, she walked the rooms with her phone out, and I thought she was taking pictures of the decorations. Henry told me later she'd been measuring. He saw her doing it in the dining room, holding up her thumb against the window, squinting, measuring our windows for curtains she meant to hang after we were gone. The whole thing started, really, the spring before last when Sloane's parents lost their place down in Hartford. Lyle and Bonnie. Lyle had been a contractor who never paid his taxes right, and the bill finally came due all at once, the way it does. And between that and a second mortgage they'd taken out for reasons nobody ever explained to me, they were going to lose the house. Now, I'm not without sympathy. Watching people your own age lose their footing is a hard thing. If they had come to me honestly, if they'd sat at my table and said, "Estelle, we're frightened. Can you help us think this through?" I would have helped them think it through. I would have helped them find a senior apartment, the good kind, near a clinic and a grocery store. I had the means to make it soft for them. But that isn't what they wanted. What they wanted was to move in here. It came out at Easter, the first version of it. Bradley brought it up over ham like he was suggesting we rotate the tires. Mom, the lake house is huge. It's 3 bedrooms and you use one. Lyle and Bonnie could take the back too, you'd barely know they're here, and they'd help out. Bonnie cooks. Lyle's handy. He said it so casually, so reasonably, that for a moment I almost heard it as reasonable. That's the trick of it. They wrap the unthinkable in the language of helpfulness until you feel like the unreasonable one for flinching. I said no, gently, but no. I said I love my home and my privacy, that Lyle and Bonnie deserve their own dignity and their own front door, and that I'd be glad to help them find that. Bonnie cried. Sloane went cold. And Bradley, my son, the boy who cried at animal movies, looked at me across the table and said, I didn't think you'd be like this. I should have known then how far it had already gone. But I'm a patient woman, and I told myself it was grief talking. Theirs and mine. I let it go. It was Henry's brother who tipped me off that it was something worse. We'd had a break-in scare that June, my neighbor's place, not mine, and I'd taken the chance to put in a real security system. Cameras at the doors, a couple inside in the main rooms, all of it on my phone and backed up to a server my old colleague set up for me. Because if there's one thing I learned in 38 years, it's that the cloud is just somebody else's computer. I told the family I'd had a motion light installed. That's all. A motion light because of the break-in. Nobody asked further. Nobody ever imagines the old lady understands the equipment. So in July, when Bradley and Sloane drove up to check on me, while I was supposedly at my book club, I was actually at my book club, but I was also watching my own living room on my phone in the parking lot of the library, while Carol talked about a novel none of us had finished. I watched my son walk through my house opening drawers. I watched him in Henry's office, going through the filing cabinet. I watched Sloane stand in the doorway of the master bedroom with that thumb up against the window again. And I heard them because the system has sound, talking about me as if I were already gone. She's not going to do it willingly, Sloane said. She doesn't have to do it willingly, Bradley said. She just has to do it. Once the POA is in place, we don't need her to agree to anything. POA, power of attorney. My son, going through my late husband's files, talking about getting himself power of attorney over me. I sat in that library parking lot and I did not cry, though I wanted to. I have a poker face that can survive a house fire. I drove home, I let myself in the back, and I made myself a cup of tea, and I started planning the way I'd planned 100 cases before this one, except this one had my own name on the file. Here's the thing they did not understand about me. The thing nobody who underestimates a woman my age ever understands. I knew exactly what they were going to try because I'd watched a dozen versions of it from the other side of a conference table. The playbook is always the same. First, isolate. They'd already started dropping comments to my friends that I was getting forgetful, repeating myself, that they were worried about Mom. Second, manufacture a crisis or a kindness that requires you to sign something. Third, get the power of attorney, or get yourself added to the accounts and the deed, and after that the person doesn't matter anymore. The person becomes a formality. So I went to see Curtis. Curtis had been my friend and my lawyer for 30 years, since back when he was a young man fresh from law school renting an office over the hardware store, and I was the bank's forensic accountant feeding him cases. He's 71 now, semi-retired, plays a vicious game of cribbage, and he is the only person besides Henry I have ever fully trusted. I sat in his office with the good coffee and I told him everything, and I watched his face do the thing it does, the stillness that means he's already 3 moves ahead. They haven't done anything yet, he said. Legally. Snooping isn't a crime if you let your kid into your house. I know. You want to wait for them to do something. I want to wait for them to do something they can't take back. He nodded slowly. And in the meantime, I said, we make sure that when they reach for the house, there's nothing to grab. What we did over the next 4 months, the 2 of us, was quiet and completely legal and absolutely airtight. We moved the house, the accounts, the investments Henry and I had built over 40 years, all of it, into a revocable living trust. I was the trustee while I lived, in full control, able to spend a dime or $100,000 at my own discretion. But the deed no longer had my name on it the way they'd be expecting. The house belonged to the trust. You cannot add yourself to a deed that's held in trust by talking a widow into signing a form at her kitchen table. You cannot get power of attorney over a trust by convincing a doctor she's confused. The trust had a successor named, and it wasn't Bradley. We named where everything would go, and I'll tell you about that, because it's the part that matters most to me. And I kept recording. Not to entrap them, my lawyer was very clear about the line, Vermont being a one-party consent state, meaning I could legally record conversations I was part of, and the cameras in my own home were my right. I wasn't goading them into anything. I was simply living my life and letting it be witnessed. If they chose to plan a fraud in my living room, that was their choice, made freely in front of a camera I'd installed for a break-in they'd never once asked about again. By October, the maples had turned and the drive looked like he was on fire, just the way Henry built it to, and I knew it was coming to a head because Lyle and Bonnie had run out of time on their place. The crisis they needed had arrived on schedule. Bradley called and said the family should all do Thanksgiving up at the lake, like the old days, and would it be all right if Lyle and Bonnie came and stayed a few nights, since they were between places? A few nights. I knew what a few nights meant. A few nights meant boxes in the garage by Christmas. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I made the turkey the way Henry liked it, with the sage and the orange peel under the skin. I made the cardamom rolls. I set the good table, my mother's china, the cloth napkins, the candlesticks Henry gave me for our 25th. I want you to picture it, because they did not see what was underneath it. They saw a tired old woman who'd given up the fight, putting on a nice spread to make peace. They thought they'd won. The whole afternoon, every kindness I did them, they took as surrender. Lyle and Bonnie arrived with 4 suitcases. 4. For a few nights. I carried one of Bonnie's bags up to the back bedroom myself, and I smiled and I said how nice it would be to have a full house. And Bonnie squeezed my hand and got teary and said, "We're so grateful, Estelle. We knew you'd come around." Came around. As if my own home were a thing they'd been negotiating me out of. Dinner was, on the surface, lovely. The food was good. Bradley carved. We said what we were thankful for. And when it came to me, I said I was thankful for 40 good years with Henry in this house. And I watched Sloane's jaw tighten at the word house. And I went on eating. It was over the pie that they brought out the folder. Bradley slid it across the table to me, right past the cranberry sauce, the way he'd slid a dozen folders past his father over the years. "Mom, we want to make things easier on you. You're alone up here. It's a lot of house to manage, the taxes, the upkeep. We've had a lawyer drop some papers, simple stuff that just lets me help you handle the money side, so you don't have to worry about any of it anymore. A power of attorney." I didn't open the folder. I already knew exactly what was in it because I'd seen the form on his laptop screen on a camera in July. "That's thoughtful," I said. "Why don't I have my own attorney look it over?" The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "You don't need a lawyer for this, Mom. It's family. All the more reason," I said pleasantly, "to have it done right." Sloane set down her fork. "Estelle, with respect, we've been more than patient. Mom and Dad have nowhere to go. You have an entire empty house. You're sitting up here alone in 3,000 square feet while they sleep in a motel and you want to stall over paperwork?" "I want to stall," I said, and I kept my voice as warm as I could, the grandmother voice. "Over signing away control of everything Henry and I built to people who measured my windows for curtains while I was still using them." The table went very quiet. Bonnie's mouth opened and closed. Lyle looked at the tablecloth. "That's a horrible thing to say," Sloane said, and her voice had climbed. "Is it untrue?" That was when she came around the table. I'd be lying if I said I planned the exact shape of what happened next, because I didn't. You can't. People make their own choices. That was always the point. But I knew the pressure was there, and I knew that people who feel a thing slipping out of their hands will grab. She came around the table fast, and she had the serving fork in her hand, the big 2-tined one from the turkey. And I think to this day she didn't mean to do quite what she did, but it doesn't matter what she meant. She grabbed for the folder, and I had my hand on it, and she brought the fork down to make me let go. And the tines caught the back of my hand and tore, and I jerked back, and the gravy boat went over and broke against the floor, and there was blood on my mother's white tablecloth, my blood, bright red on the linen, and my son looked at the floor and looked at my hand and said, "Mom, why do you have to make everything so hard? You're being selfish. After everything they've done for you. After everything they've done for me." I stood up. The room was waiting for me to scream, or cry, or collapse. I did none of those things. I picked up my cloth napkin and wrapped it around my hand, and I said in a voice so calm it frightened them more than yelling would have, "There's apple pie on the counter. The vanilla's in the freezer. Lock up when you leave." I got my purse, I got my keys, and I drove myself to the urgent care on Route 7 with the radio off, and while the nurse, a lovely young woman, cleaned the wound and put in 4 stitches, I took out my phone with my good hand and I sent one text to Curtis. They moved. We're done waiting. And then I sat in that bright little room and I let myself feel it. Finally, the grief of it, because the planning was over and there was nothing left to do but feel. My son, my boy with the dandelions, gone. Not dead, which is worse in its way, because you keep the body and lose the person. Then I dried my face, because there was work to do. The next morning, Curtis came to the house at 8, with 2 thermoses of coffee in his old leather case. We sat at the same kitchen table, and we built the file the way I'd built 100 files, except neat and labeled, and complete in a way that would make a prosecutor weep with gratitude. The footage from July of Bradley going through Henry's cabinet talking about getting the POA, whether she agrees or not. The footage from Thanksgiving, all of it, the folder sliding across the table, Sloan coming around with the fork, the injury, my son's exact words, the urgent care record, time-stamped, with the photographs the nurse had taken of my hand because, she told me kindly, in case it was someone, the original power of attorney form they'd had drawn up, which I'd kept, and which named Bradley as my attorney in fact, with no oversight, no successor, no safeguards, a document designed not to help me, but to replace me. We filed for a restraining order first. Curtis was matter-of-fact about it. You're a 68-year-old woman who was injured with a weapon in her own home by a family member during a coerced financial document signing. That's not a hard sell to a judge. That's a Tuesday. We sent the footage to the state's attorney. Vermont takes elder financial exploitation seriously now, more seriously than people my children's age realize, and a documented attempt to obtain power of attorney through deception and intimidation, with a recorded assault on top of it, is not a family squabble. It's a case. And then, because I am who I am, I made one more call, to the bank where Bradley's consulting company kept its accounts. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I simply, as a private citizen who happened to know how these things work, suggested that someone might want to look at whether a business in financial distress had been representing my assets, my home, as collateral or as projected family resources in any loan application. I had a feeling. 38 years gives you feelings. The feeling turned out to be correct. He told a lender in writing that he expected to consolidate family real estate holdings, meaning my house, the house that no longer belonged to me but to a trust he had no power over, into the business. He had borrowed against a thing that was never his. It came apart for them the way these things always come apart, not in one dramatic crash but in a long grinding collapse. The restraining order went through. The state's attorney brought charges against Sloan for the assault and against both of them for the attempted exploitation, and while the criminal side moved slow, the loan fraud moved fast, because banks do not have patience and do not have feelings. The lender called the note. The SUV got repossessed out of their driveway on a Sunday. Lyle and Bonnie, who had pinned their last hopes on moving into my back bedrooms, ended up exactly where they'd have ended up if they'd simply asked me honestly in a senior apartment, except now there was no daughter and son-in-law with money to help, because there was no money, and there was no help from me, because they had sat at my table and watched me bleed and said nothing. I want to tell you it felt like winning. It didn't. The day I heard Bradley had taken a plea, 6 months in a diversion program, restitution, mandatory counseling, no felony if he completed it, I sat on Henry's bench at the end of the dock for a long time and I cried the way I hadn't let myself cry in months. Curtis sat with me. He didn't say anything wise. He just sat there with his coffee, and after a while he said, "You did right by him, Estelle. You gave him every off-ramp. He took none of them. That's not on you." And I said, "I know, and I did know, and it didn't help. The way knowing rarely does. But I'll tell you the part that did help, the part Henry would have cared about. When Curtis and I built that trust, we named where everything would go, and it wasn't going to be sold off for curtains and a leased SUV and somebody else's tax debt. There's a young woman named Daniela Reyes. She was Henry's home health aide in those last weeks. the one who learned which side he liked his pillow on, who used to sing to him low in the afternoons when the pain medication made him drift. She was putting herself through nursing school 16 credits at a time, working doubles, and she'd told me once, shyly, that she dreamed of working in hospice, of being for other dying people what she'd been for Henry. I funded her. All of it. Tuition, books, the whole degree through the community foundation so it would be done right and outlast me. She started her clinical rotations this past spring and she sends me a photograph every few weeks, in her scrubs, grinning. And I put each one on the refrigerator under a magnet shaped like a maple leaf. And there's the veterans' home over in Colchester, where Henry used to volunteer on Saturdays, sitting with men who had no one left to sit with them, playing checkers and listening to stories about wars and women long gone. A good chunk of what Henry and I built is building them a new common room. A real one, with big windows that look out at the mountains and a fireplace that works. They asked if they could put his name on it. I told them to call it the Henry and Estelle Wing, and a man on the phone said, "Both names?" And I said yes, both, because we built everything together, the house and the maples and the dock and the life, and I am not going to start leaving myself off of it now. It's October again, as I write this to you. The maples are doing their slow fire down the drive, 2 rows of them, the color of a struck match. I'm sitting at the kitchen table where so much was decided, a cup of tea going cold beside me, and I can hear the lake through the open window, doing what it's done for 40 years. Bradley wrote to me last month, a real letter, in his actual handwriting, which I hadn't seen in years. He's through the program. He's working at a lumberyard of all things, his father's old world. He said he understands now what he did, and that he doesn't expect me to forgive him, and that he thinks about the dandelions, which means he remembers them too, which I didn't know. I haven't written back yet. I might not. I'm 68, and I've learned that you don't owe anyone the ending they're hoping for, not even your own child. And that forgiveness, when it comes on its own schedule, or not at all. And either way is allowed. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the whole story, whether I have regrets, whether I was too hard, whether a mother shouldn't have just signed a paper and kept the peace and her boy. And I tell them what Henry told me in that front bedroom with his hand going cold in mine. The house was the one thing that was truly mine. Not because of the wood and the windows. Because it was the proof of a life 2 people built honestly, with their own hands, asking nothing they hadn't earned. I could give that life away to people who valued it, a young nurse, a room full of old soldiers. But I would not let it be taken by people who only wanted to measure my windows. This evening, I'll do what I do most evenings. I'll walk down to the bench at the end of the dock, the one Henry built, and I'll sit a while as the light goes gold and then gray over the water. I'm lonely some nights. I won't pretend I'm not. But there's a difference I've found between lonely and unsafe, and I have only ever feared the second one. The house is quiet. The trust is doing its quiet work, and I'm still here, in the home we made, watching the maples burn down to nothing and knowing they'll come back green in the spring the way they always have, the way Henry planted them to.